from within begins to take on an organizational structure with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the post-war period. And of course, the question is, what will a new organization that has just been formed, the American Legion, do in this very explosive moment? And the American Legion, which is the veterans organization, this is the organization that is created for World War I veterans here in Paris, and is sort of meant to be a kind of, club, social club for veterans. But the leaders of the American Legion used to be set out right from the very beginning a very clear political agenda. And their political agenda is 100% Americanism, very anti-immigrant, and anti-Bolshevik. Right? 100% Americanism to them is stop immigration, and of course, staunchly anti-communist, protect capitalism. And as this organization with this political agenda is forming, during a moment where there is increased vigilantism and violence against radicals of all sorts, the question really is in the balance here of how much veterans will serve to propel this forward or not. And in the beginning, especially in 1919, it looks like veterans are very willing to join in. There's plenty of evidence of Legion Post, new Legion Post veterans taking the lead in breaking up strikes, becoming their own sort of neighborhood watch committees, roaming throughout, seeking out subversives, grabbing those people by the collar and hauling them down to the police station. And in a few cases, we have cases of Legion members lynching members of the Wobblies, of the IWW. The one thing we don't have, and this is quite interesting when you compare it to what happens after the Civil War, we don't have a lot of examples of the Legion taking a lead in racial violence. Not to say veterans don't participate, but the Legion does not take a lead in terms of the racial violence that I'm going to talk to you in a moment there. And so the question is, how is order going to be restored? And here's where we'll see some differences between what happens, say, in Eastern Europe. Where in Eastern Europe, we start to see the same phenomenon, but there, in the absence of state power, it deepens and the veterans organization's involvement in violence increases. In the United States, where we still have a very strong state, even though there are veterans certainly participating in this, and we certainly can see 1919 as an incredibly violent time, we see it as relatively short. And we see it as short for a few reasons. One is that the state reasserts its monopoly over violence. Most of these wartime organizations, like the Home Guards that were protecting bridges and facilities, and the American Protective Leagues that were sending out these kind of notices that I read to you, these disband. And so you do have the Ku Klux Klan, which obviously continues, but all these other groups disband. The second thing is that the state actually meets the demands of those that are purveying this vigilante violence. We have the Red Scare, where aliens suspected of being radicals are arrested and are deported. We have immigration restrictions. We have continued restrictions on free speech. So in other words, you don't have to be concerned that the state is not meeting your fears. The state is acting to take care of the threat that you identify. But the other important thing is that the Legion begins to police itself. And after 1920, the American Legion makes a decision. It has to begin policing itself, so it sort of mutes a little bit of its reactionary impulses and becomes, in a sense, a sort of lobbying group for veterans' benefits. But it'll never lose that reputation. And people will remember in the 1920s and the 1930s the reactionary elements of the Legion. And it will be something that hurts it dramatically among working class veterans, especially as a legitimate veterans organization in the future. But the greatest violence occurs in the area of race relations in the United States. And here we can see that really the war have African American soldiers and African American leaders coming out of the war with a completely different idea in mind. The idea that having served honorably in the military, now the government would take the lead in protecting black civil rights, and they intend to fight for those rights as well. Now, just as I pointed out that the violence against suspected radicals was significant, the racial violence in the post-war period in 1919 was very significant as well. In 1 year, 25 race riots throughout the nation, 77 lynchings, including 10 of African American soldiers. This is in 1 year. So when we speak about racial violence, and the term that's often used is the Red Summer of 1919, we are not just talking about a little bit or an occasional here or there. This is really threatening in the United States to erupt into a racial war. And again, when we know the end of the story, it's easy to underestimate what people who are in the middle of it actually feel. They don't know that things will in fact improve. But it really seems like the violence is spiraling out of control. And what's important to emphasize about this racial violence is that the militancy and the idea of using violence to attain a certain political goal is not in the post-war period simply on the part of racist whites. The war has also interjected a new ethos of violence into the civil rights movement. And it has both rhetorical and real elements. And it's a militancy that really revolves around this new notion of fighting back. And so when I tell you that there are these racial riots nationwide, your image should not just be of whites attacking blacks and blacks passively accepting that or lamenting their fates. Instead, for the first time in a sort of widespread way, we see actual fighting back. In Chicago and DC especially, two of the biggest and most well-publicized riots, organized self-defense by African Americans of their communities when they are attacked. And this will continue in 1920, 1921, Rosewood, Tulsa. We'll see black veterans especially taking the lead in terms of organizing their communities for self-defense. So we see real violence. We also see rhetorical calls for self-defense. This comes within the Garvey movement. Marcus Garvey organizing not just a rhetorical call for self-defense, but actually organizing black legions, which are veterans groups. When black veterans come home to organize themselves as militia within the Garvey movement, drill on weekends publicly so that they're seen, and legions that are seen by Garvey in speeches that he gives as the skeleton army for the future African state. So the idea here of violence, and violence perhaps being an acceptable means for reaching a political goal, is actually seen on both sides of the racial divide when we look at 1919. But of course, what happens to the Garvey movement, in a sense, is somewhat similar to what happens to those who would use violence as purely the way to achieve the goal of purging America of radicals, which is that the state suppresses the Garvey movement. Doesn't do such a good job suppressing the Ku Klux Klan, It definitely goes after the Garvey movement here, and reasserts its ability to squash this as a potential alternative for civil rights in the United States. So what do we have if we look at this brutalization thesis? We clearly have examples of post-war violence. We clearly have a sense of challenges to the state's legitimate use of violence that in the end the state is actually able to meet fairly well. And so of it, and that's because the Supreme Court rules against them, right? At the very last minute, they don't succeed, and Caldwell is executed. And it seems that in a lot of ways, when we want to tell the story of these things, we want the successes, not the failures. So Caldwell's case is not an example of success because it doesn't work, ultimately, in terms of saving his life. But it does do a few important things. And it does some very important things in terms of setting a new direction in the civil rights movement. Right? First of all, it shows us that the war could lead not just to brutalization and reactionary violence, but that the war could also sow the seeds for community-based collective action on behalf of civil rights. And it's really worth, I feel, remembering, and this is maybe the thing we forget the most about the civil rights movement in the United States, where we want to look back and credit Martin Luther King with every important thing that happens in that movement. But that the civil rights movement was only possible because of thousands and thousands of individual people in towns and cities throughout the South who organized themselves and fought back collectively. And here we're seeing, coming out of the war, almost a prototype for that kind of collective action that is later going to be so successful. And the war has provided not just the motivation, but the opportunity to continue as well. Right? And we'll see if we keep looking at this, that in fact the veterans' cause gives further opportunity even for groups like the NAACP to continue to agitate on behalf of civil rights in the 1920s. And that is that, again, selecting very intentionally the cause of the black veteran, whom the federal government, the black disabled veteran, whom the civil government has said actually has certain rights, and trying to force the federal government to recognize those rights creates a kind of, is a focus of the NAACP throughout the 1920s that in a sense parallels the goals of the Caldwell Defense Group. And what they share in common is a desire to interest the federal government in the cause of civil rights and to force the federal government to use its power to defend civil rights. Right? And again, if we look to the future of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, the greatest successes come when the movement is able to get the federal government to intervene on behalf of protecting African American civil rights, whether it's through a Supreme Court decision, the deployment of armed forces, marshals, or federal law. And this case that I was just telling you about of the black Florida teenager, this was the call. Florida could not be trusted to do the right thing. The call is for federal investigators to go down and actually uncover what happened. So even today, this idea of turning to the federal government to come in and guarantee civil rights is very, very present in the movement here. And so these are things that come out of the war as well and are laying the foundations for important precedents, for important developments that are going to come later on in the century. Right? So this is where we can see a very conscious turn away from violence on the part of veterans in support of nonviolent collective social justice campaigns that use other methods for advancing political goals. And then the second area comes through this idea of redistributing wealth and redistributing income. And here's where we actually get to irony. Because as I've said, the Legion, which sees itself as 100% American and completely anti-communist, instead will become in the 1920s and 90s
ça va rester vraiment dans les souvenirs des assistants, et en particulier bien sûr des étudiants qui sont là, et cette façon de relier la Première Guerre mondiale et surtout la fin de la sortie de la Première Guerre mondiale et de bâtir la paix d'une certaine façon jusqu'à la deuxième, donc 20 ans plus tard, 40 ans plus tard, c'est effectivement tout à fait intéressant, cet héritage, ces références historiques, cette mémoire qui existe et la façon dont il y a cet héritage politique. Donc, eh bien, donc nous allons pouvoir prendre des questions et la seule chose, vous pouvez bien sûr les poser soit en français, soit en anglais, ça ne pose aucun problème. Simplement, je vous demanderai auparavant peut-être de dire votre nom de façon à ce qu'on sache un petit peu simplement comme ça. Y a-t-il quelqu'un qui veut commencer? Bon, si vous ne voulez pas dire votre nom, alors vous ne le dites pas et vous commencez, ça ne fait rien. Oui.
Est-ce qu'on prend un micro ou est-ce que ça va?
Il était possible de fermer la fenêtre si ça arrive, mais je pense que, bon, moi j'ai pris un micro, mais franchement, je pense que Jennifer n'en avait pas vraiment besoin et que cela, ce n'est pas vraiment indispensable. Mais par contre, on peut éventuellement fermer la fenêtre parce qu'il y a ce bruit de la rue qui peut être peut-être un peu perturbateur. Merci beaucoup, Alia. Bon, maintenant que vous savez que vous ne pouvez pas attendre de micro.
J'ai une question.
Voilà.
D'abord, je voulais. Je peux parler en français?
Oui, bien sûr.
D'abord,
je vais reprendre en anglais.
Oui, voilà. D'abord, je me présente Alia Aglan, professeure d'histoire contemporaine parisien, spécialiste plutôt de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Mais bon, on fait un séminaire avec les étudiants, avec Nicolas Offenstadt, sur les deux guerres mondiales pour les masters. Et donc, je voulais vous remercier, mais vraiment vous remercier pour une conférence extrêmement intéressante. Moi, j'ai appris beaucoup de choses. Et surtout, vous remercier de nous débarrasser de cette idée de brutalisation des sociétés qui, en réalité, nous empêche de travailler au-delà. C'est-à-dire que, bon, certes, c'est une théorie qui est importante, intéressante, mais qui a été en France tellement reprise et tellement adaptée à chaque situation, on a le sentiment, en vous écoutant, d'un vrai renouveau, enfin même d'un rafraîchissement, pour vous dire clairement les choses. Et donc je voulais vous remercier de ça. D'autre part, je voulais savoir si, en comparant, je ne sais pas si c'est dans vos travaux d'avoir comparé les deux démobilisations, est-ce que la seconde démobilisation, c'est-à-dire après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, n'a pas revêtu des aspects plus dramatiques que la première? Ça, c'était une question. Et la deuxième question serait de savoir si on pourrait faire la lecture des années 20 en France, en Europe, en Allemagne, avec l'idée que vous avancez que la guerre, paradoxalement, apporte aussi une culture de non-violence. Je pense au mouvement pacifiste, donc ça a été étudié dans ce sens-là, mais à un autre niveau de mobilisation, est-ce que vous voyez des mouvements comparables en Europe? Voilà.
Well, I'll just go to the first question about the comparison of the demobilization between the First and Second World Wars within the United States. And what is actually interesting about that is that one of the political arguments in favor of adopting a very broad plan of veterans benefits in 1944, not 1945 or not 1946, but in a sense to be very prepared for demobilization this time rather than waiting until the war actually ended, was warnings against what the bonus march had represented, and warnings that if it was, there were real concerns that this was a revolutionary moment in 1932, that this could lead, the critics of the bonus marchers accused them of planning a coup d'etat, that they're there to overthrow the government. And so the fear that if 4 million veterans could create so much turmoil, what would 16 million veterans do after the Second World War? The idea was very much to contain any potential radicalization of the World War II veteran community by meeting their personal needs immediately. So not giving them that same sort of chance to organize politically and to perhaps become radicalized as a result of having been in military service. And certainly after the Second World War, there were certainly labor problems and there were racial problems as well, but not to go too much into history, but I think you could really continue with this theme in that it's immediately after the Second World War, in 1948, that the military is desegregated. And it's desegregated in part because of post-war racial violence, and now in a new Cold War context that puts, and as well as a new black political strength in the North, it sort of changes the international situation, the domestic political situation, and leads Truman to do what the civil rights movement has been asking for a long time. So you actually see a lot of successes. You see violence, but you see again that community organization that really leads to, in this sense, very successful conclusion of desegregation. So I guess what I would say is that that past history is influencing policymaking, and you certainly do see similar episodes of violence and it resulting with collective nonviolent solutions that result in progress in civil rights. In terms of how this process works itself out, it's interesting because this was exactly the theme of the workshop, was to think about how did this actually compare across time and across societies. And it seems that in the vast majority of cases, it is in fact a rejection of the brutalization thesis, that where people are arguing that you are seeing civil wars, say, for example, in Eastern Europe, but these are not results of being brutalized by the war. These are actually, in a context of the situation, sort of rational ways to, if war can be considered rational, but that they really are separate wars. So in other words, it's not as if it's all one big war, but these are actually a series of wars that unfurl afterwards that all have their own dynamics and their own rationales. I think that I would have to say, it's a little bit of a vague answer because it's not exactly my area, but it was interesting to see the extent to which brutalization was rejected, as you might expect in Australia or in the French Empire, but in Germany